In this video, we're going to go ahead and set up our remote Git repository on Bitbucket. We're going to clone it down to our computer. We're going to create our Visual Studio projects and then push it back up. We're going to be using Git for our source control. Now, of course, we need source control because this is a project that we're working on, and any project that you work on must be under source control, and we're using Git because it's so far my favorite source control system or version control system. Now, the choice that you'll have to make is where you want that code to live on the internet, or if you want to at all. In order for us to be able to work with our continuous integration server, the CI server needs to be able to pull down the changes that we make in order to build the latest binaries and other sorts of packages. We want to be able to work locally and then push our changes to somewhere where the CI server can access, because the CI server is not going to be the same computer as our development machine. So I'm choosing Bitbucket as a place to store our code online. The reason I'm doing that is because what's up here in this big header, unlimited private code repositories for free. There are alternate services that you could use instead, such as GitHub. However, GitHub requires that you purchase a plan in order to have private repositories. Now, what do I mean by private repositories? I mean repositories that aren't accessible from the internet without logging into your account or without granting explicit permission to access that repository. So like open source projects. With GitHub, you can have a free account, you can have as many public repositories as you want, but you have to pay in order to get a limited amount of private repositories. So I'm using Bitbucket. And again, the only reason I'm using this is for a place online that I can stuff the code that I'm working on. Serves as a off-site backup as well as a convenient place for multiple computers to access it from. And it's free and all that goodness. So you'll want to go ahead and create an account. So create an account by putting in a username, an email address, and a password. I'm going to log into my account over here. Then I'm going to hit create on repository. So if you just created a Bitbucket account for the first time, what you're going to get is a tutorial. You want to go ahead and skip that tutorial, and then by hitting the little skip button next to the button at the bottom, and then be sure to hit the create button. Now the create button will allow us to create a repository on Bitbucket servers. This still doesn't quite yet let us pull the code down so we can modify it, but it's the first step. We have to put a place online for us to put our code before we can pull it down and start working with it. So for the parameters of the repository that I'm creating, I'm going to make sure the owner is me. The name is going to be Buzz MMO. After we fill in the name, we can put in any description that we want. We want to make sure that the access level is set to private. We want to make sure that our forking policy only allows private forks and that our repository type is Git. We don't need issue tracking or a wiki. So go ahead and create a repository. What we have now is a place on Bitbucket where we can push our code and pull from to get changes to our code. That was a very contrived sentence. Really what I'm just trying to say is we now have a place online where our code can live. But that doesn't quite solve the problem of us being able to access this place on our local computer. To do that, we need a Git client. Now, you could certainly go and download the Git executables from the main project website and download them and use the command line version of Git in order to interact with our repository. But instead, I'm going to use SourceTree. Now, SourceTree is one of the many different Git wrappers or GUI wrappers over Git that are available. The thing about SourceTree is that it's free. I will say right now, however, I don't use SourceTree on a day-to-day basis. I only use it when I'm recording videos about Git, and the reason is because I use SmartGit, but SmartGit is not free, and because of that, I want to keep everything as free as possible. So we'll be using SourceTree in these videos to interact with our repository. What this tool will allow us to do is it'll allow us to access the code that will be stored on our repository online, make changes, and then push them back up. It'll also give us a lot of awesome features, such as viewing the log of all the changes we've made to the project over the course of us working on it, and it'll give us a GUI interface, which is redundant, I know, or I'll just say, okay, fine. It'll give us a GUI for doing things like branching, merging, setting tags, setting up remotes, and all that fun stuff. So it's like working with Git, but a lot easier because it's a nice little GUI.
Alrighty.
Awesome. So once you go ahead and get this downloaded, and while you do that, I'm just going to bring up my instance that I already have downloaded, and make sure that you have this installed. We're going to run into a problem right off the bat, though, because a question that I'm sure people are asking themselves is, how does Bitbucket know that I am who I say I am? A person might think, oh, we'll just ask for a username and password, and yes, that is one of the options you get with Bitbucket, is you can certainly have it ask you for a username and password every time you modify your repository. But this isn't the way we're going to do it, and it isn't the way you really ever want to work with Git unless you're pulling down like a read-only open source repo or something like that. Really, when working with Git, you should always be using your SSH keys that you will generate on a per computer basis. So I'm going to show you guys how to basically authenticate SourceTree, or our instance of SourceTree, on our particular computer with our Bitbucket account, so that we can access this repository from our local computer. This is a process that you will need to repeat for every single computer and every single user on every single computer that you want to have access with or to your Bitbucket account, or to whatever Git hosting account that you might have, including hosting that you might be doing yourself. Effectively, what we're doing is we're replacing the concept of a password with what's called a key file. Well, it's actually a key pair. We're going to have a public key and a private key, and we're going to use a special tool to generate those keys for us to make it really easy. And then we're going to upload our public key to our Bitbucket account so that Bitbucket knows that we are who we say we are. Now, the process of doing this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to go up to Tools, Create or Import SSH Keys, and then I'm going to hit Generate. Now, Generate is going to ask that I randomly move my mouse cursor all around the screen so it generates my private key file. Okay, so now I've created my public-private key pair just by doing that. And up here is our public key. This key is, like its name suggests, public. You don't care if other people know this. This is not secure private information, which is, of course, why I'm leaving it up here on the screen in a recorded video. The only thing that this public key allows a person to do is to see if a particular bit of communication came from you, or if you were lying about who you were. And that's exactly what the process of authentication is, which is why we're using this to hook up our Bitbucket account with our local computer. However, we also need to save our private key somewhere. So I'm going to hit the Save Private Key button, and it's going to ask me if I want to save this key without a passphrase, or with or without a passphrase. Now, a passphrase on a private key is a further level of security, where every time you try to access that private key, it'll ask you for a password. I don't want to do this, though, because that gets kind of old very quickly. In certain situations, you might want to, however. So I'm just going to hit Yes, and I'm going to save my private key somewhere on my computer. I think I'm actually just going to dump it here on my desktop on my new folder 21. Well, that sounds like a nice new folder that I have there.
I love that.
And I'm just going to overwrite my putty.ppk file that I generated previously, because this is a throwaway key that I'm generating just for this one project. Again, you won't have to do this per project when you're working from the same computer. You should only do this step per computer, but for the sake of teaching this, I am not using my normal public-private key pair. So this will save it in the putty private key file format. Now, not all Git clients will require this format. Some Git clients will require a different format. You can use the same tool that we just opened to convert between the different formats, but conveniently it automatically generates putty private key files, which is what SourceTree wants. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to overwrite that file. So now I have my private key, right here. Now, this private key is not something you ever want to share ever, ever, ever. If somebody has access to this, they will be able to impersonate you. That's not a good thing. Again, you should generate this on a per computer, per user basis. So now that I have my private key generated and I have my public key, which just for the sake of, just for the convenience sake, I'm going to copy this key and I'm going to save it in a text file next to my private key. And I'm just going to say public key, and I'm going to paste it in. Just so that, I can get, you can derive a public key from private key, but it's just nicer to have it in a text file. So now that I have my public and private key generated, how do I tell Bitbucket that I'm going to be logging in with this private key? Because right now, I've generated a private key. Bitbucket doesn't know anything about it. It doesn't know that it's really coming from me, so I'm really still back at square one. To do that, I'm going to again copy this right here, and I'm going to jump back into Bitbucket over here. I'm going to go to my account options, which you can access by clicking your profile picture at the top right and going to manage account. Inside here, we have this SSH keys option, which we can go ahead and add our public keys to. You can add as many as you wish. You typically, again, add one per user per computer that you would like to access your Bitbucket source code on. This same process applies to GitHub, actually. The only difference is that GitHub uses a different key format than SourceTree. So if you're following along with GitHub, just search for the Windows tutorial. It's very straightforward. So I'm going to add key. I'm going to give it a label of Buzz MMO test, and I'm going to paste my public key in here. I'm going to hit add key. So now my public key is associated with my Bitbucket account. So any repository my Bitbucket account has access to can be accessed by using the private key that corresponds to the public key I just put up. Again, the way that the public and private keys are linked requires quite a bit of math and cryptography, but suffice to say that they're both linked, basically. By sending my public key up to Bitbucket, it now knows that if I try to log in using my private key, it will let me in. And again, the way it does that is actually, it's kind of cool, actually. The way that the public and private keys are derived, if I encrypt information with my private key, the only way to decrypt it is with my public key. So that's how Bitbucket knows it's me. It just has to decrypt information that I send to it and match it with the public key that I put here and match it up and words. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm running out of words.
Well, it's very cool.
Yeah, it's very fun stuff. So now that we've done that, let's go back into SourceTree and pull down our repository. We'll have one more issue we'll run into, but it's fairly easy to fix. So I'm going to hit clone new. And cloning is the process of copying a repository from one location and putting it into another, and then creating a link between the two. That part's important. So although I am really just copying the repository I have in Bitbucket into my local file system, I am also setting up a link between the repository on my file system and the repository on Bitbucket, allowing me to conveniently be able to push and pull code to and from the internet. Now the URL of the repository is going to be git@bitbucket.org:account name, which is Nelson LeKay, /repo name, which is going to be buzzmmo.git. I'll click off it, and when I click off it, it'll try to check the source. In addition, if this is your first time connecting to Bitbucket, it'll ask you if you want to accept an RSA fingerprint. You'll just want to hit yes to that. So now we have one last problem. We generated our public and private keys. We told Bitbucket about our public key, but we haven't told SourceTree about our private key. SourceTree doesn't know what private key to use when communicating with Bitbucket. So what we're going to do is we're going to say yes. because that's going to load the SSH key agent called Pageant. And it's going to load it into our tray. So let's go ahead and open up our system tray, find Pageant, which it looks like this. It's the PuTTY authentication agent. Just double click on that. Now, on your screen, you will likely not see anything here. What you're seeing right here, though, is I have a public-private key pair for my own personal and business stuff that is in a well-known location. It's in C users nelson.ssh idrsa, and Pageant automatically loaded in that key because it's from an obvious location that it scans by default. You won't probably, unless you have a key in that location, won't have an item in this list. So now we need to tell Pageant about our private key, which conveniently I'm already in my awesome new folder 21, and I have putty.ppk here. Now Pageant only understands PuTTY private key files, PPKs, which fortunately is the format that we saved our private key file in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and hit open, and then I'm going to hit close because now I have that private key loaded into Pageant. Now that I've done that, I can hit retry in SourceTree, and I am authenticated.
Woohoo!
Now, most of these steps, in fact, none of these steps you will need to repeat if you open up another repository on Bitbucket and you access it from the same computer. It's just, this is mostly first-time setup stuff. Okay, so where am I going to dump this repository? I'm going to go ahead and dump it in MMO class, buzz MMO. And then I'm going to say folder root. I'm going to bookmark the repository, and I'm going to hit clone. Alright, so what are we looking at? We are looking at my repository, which is very blank and empty because I don't have anything in it. If I come over here to my file system where I told it to clone into, we'll notice we have a folder now, and the folder will have a .git folder in it. Do not go into this folder. Well, you can go into it all you want, but do not modify anything in this folder. This folder contains all the information Git needs to know about in order to work with the repository. So let's go ahead and add a file. I'm going to hit File, New, Text Document, and let's just say README, because that sounds like fun. And then I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to say, this is a README. And then I'm going to close it, and I'm going to save it. So I just want to show you guys the basic workflow of getting some code pushed up into Bitbucket. So now I'm going to move this off to the side, come back into SourceTree, and we'll see SourceTree picked up the fact that I have a working copy change, meaning I've made a modification on my local development machine. So let's go ahead and stage it. Now this is staged. Stage changes are changes that are basically in a little waiting list in order to be committed. Let's go ahead and commit. And I'm going to say commit message is added README. And let's say commit. Now you'll see that our stage changes is empty, our working copy changes is empty, and everything's empty again because we don't have any more pending changes. But if I go into my log history tab, we will see that we do indeed have a commit. So what do you think is going to happen, Steve, if I jump over to Bitbucket right now and load up this repository?
I think it's going to look at that and grab it and update itself.
Well, no. Bitbucket doesn't know about our changes yet. That's because we staged and committed to our local repository, but we haven't actually pushed those changes up to our remote repository. That's an important distinction that you'll have to understand about the way Git works. So let's go ahead and hit the push button, and I'm just going to hit OK. I have to hit the push master. Yeah, you see what's going on. I have to select which branch I'm pushing to the remote branch. Hit OK. Come back into Bitbucket, hit refresh. Look at that. It says Nelson Lakay pushed one commit to Buzz MMO. And if I go into my source tab, I see my source code contains a readme.txt that has the contents of this is a readme. Okay, so now we finally have a place online where we can put our code, which is awesome. Let's go ahead and build up our Visual Studio projects, and then we'll close out the video. So closing out a SourceTree and Bitbucket and Putty Keygen, I'm going to have Visual Studio open. I'm going to go to File, New, Project. Under Templates, I'm going to go to Other Project Types, Visual Studio Solutions, Blank Solution, and I'm going to give it the name of Buzz MMO. And then I'm going to give it the path of that. Then I'm going to hit OK. And then if you come over here, we see that we now have a Buzz MMO folder in it with a SLN created for us. However, I really don't like this folder structure. I would prefer that the parent folder was called SRC and not Buzz MMO, per convention that I typically use for projects like these. So to do that, I'm going to come back into Visual Studio, and I'm just going to close it out. I'm going to come back into the folder structure, and I'm going to rename Buzz MMO to SRC. Then I'm going to open up SRC, and I'm going to open up my SLN. I didn't want to change, you wouldn't have been able to change the parent folder name with Visual Studio open to that solution. So that's why I had to close Visual Studio and open it back up again. But again, that's just a convention that I prefer for this sort of thing.
Okay. And I've done many times in training before.
So now we have to wait a year while Visual Studio empties a massive empty solution. Here we go. Let's go ahead and create our projects. So what projects are we creating? We are creating new project. We're going to create a Windows class library, and we're going to call it Buzz MMO.base, and we're going to give it the .NET Framework 3.5. Make sure that you select .NET Framework 3.5 because the base is going to be used by the client. I'm going to hit OK. Wow, Visual Studio is just taking forever today.
And why are you using 3.5 for the client instead of the newer .NET?
That's because Unity only supports up to 3.5.
Ah.
And this code needs to run into Unity. Now, not all of the code that we're going to write runs in Unity, and that's why we can use .NET 4.5.1 for our server code.
I remember you saying that now that you say it again.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and delete class1.cs. I hate class1.cs. Library. And I'm going to create Buzz MMO.client. Make sure it's 3.5. Now, technically, because this code won't necessarily be ran outside of or inside of Unity directly or all the time, I could maybe get away with doing 4.5.1. But because I'm going to be sharing this code on the client project with the Unity project, I want to give it the same constraints. Again, I'm going to delete class1.cs. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to say add new project, and I'm going to do buzz mmo.client.unity. And then I'm going to delete class1.cs. Next up, let's go ahead and create our data project. So I'm going to right-click the solution, add project. Now I can take this drop-down and I can pull down to .NET 4.5.1. Then go to class library and I can say buzz mmo.data. Now remember, data is the class library that's going to contain our database abstraction layer so that we can share it between our website and our server code. Now I'm going to delete class1.cs again because I don't want that file anywhere. I'm going to add a new project, .NET Framework 4.5.1. I'm going to call it buzz mmo.server. Delete class1. Then I'm going to create buzz mmo.server.master. I'm going to delete class1.cs. Then I'm going to create buzz mmo.server.region and delete class1.cs. Okay, so here's our client code and our server code. We have our base, which is shared by everyone, our client Unity, our data, our server, our master server, and our region server. We're missing two projects. I'm going to go ahead and right click and say add new project, but instead of a class library, I'm going to create a WPF application. And I'm going to call it buzzmmo.launcher. Then I'm going to wait a year while the designer opens.
And we're waiting.
Okay. Here we go. I'm going to keep main window.xaml in there.
I'm going to keep
and I'm going to keep all this in there. Finally, we'll create our website. So I'm going to say project add new project. I'm going to click on web. I'm going to select ASP.NET MVC5 empty project. And I'm going to call it buzzmmo.web. Yeah, that's what I want to do. And now we have an empty ASP.NET MVC application. And really, that's about it as far as the projects that we're creating. You'll notice that it is the naming conventions are no mistake. I really like the way that everything layers kind of from top to bottom, except for I wish that D came after L. But unfortunately, you know, the alphabet is the way it is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add references to each of the projects. So client, I'll right click add reference, and I'll say solution, and I'll add a reference to base. Client.unity, I'll right click references, add a reference to base. Remember, client Unity is not going to have a reference to client. They're going to share code, but through file linking and not through referencing. Data is going to have a reference to base. Launcher is, not surprisingly, going to have a reference to base. Server is going to have a reference to base and data. Server master is going to have a reference to base, server, and data. Server region is going to have a reference to base, server, and data. And web is going to have a reference to base and data. Okay, so that's all I want to do for now in Visual Studio. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and create the Unity client project. So again, I'm just creating projects here so that I can commit something to the repository and get our gitignore set up. I'm not going to create, I'm going to create both the editor and the client project. So I'm going to come up here to create new project in Unity, and I'm going to say buzzmmo. And then I'm going to do, let's do something like Unity/editor, create. That creates our editor project. So now I'm going to close out of Unity again, and I'm going to create another project, which I'm going to place in the same location, except for I'm going to call it Unity Client. The Unity Client, I am going to create one scene in it. So I'm going to create a folder called Scenes. The reason I'm creating this one scene here for now is so that we'll have something to build against once we start testing our build pipeline. So I'm going to call the scene called Loader. So we have a scenes folder and we have a scene called Loader. And that's the scene that we're looking at right now. I'm also going to say File, Build Settings, Add Current, so that our loader will be in the build. Again, I'm doing this just so that in the future, when we test out our continuous integration setup, we don't have to jump into our client. It'll all be set up for us. All right, so now I'm going to
Very nice.
Let's go ahead and take a look at our folder structure. So we have source, which contains our Visual Studio solution with base, client, client Unity, data, launcher, server, server master, server region, web, and Unity, which contains our client Unity project and our editor Unity project. So now there is one more thing that we got to do before we can commit. And it'll be fairly evident if I jump back into SourceTree and look at my file status. Look at all of these files.
Oh my.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that we are committing everything, including temporary files, metadata files, and build artifacts, and just a bunch of stuff we don't want. So we want to ignore a lot of this stuff. So let's go ahead and find something that we want to ignore, like this right here, library, and say ignore. And then I'll say ignore everything beneath Unity Client Library, because we don't want the Unity Client Library. Project settings we want, assets we want. We don't want anything under Unity Editor Library. So I'm going to say ignore. I'm going to say ignore everything beneath Unity Editor Library. Okay, now we have some more complicated things that we want to be able to ignore. And that is, for example, these OBJ debug things and everything under the resharper folder and all of that stuff. Well, there's a lot easier way to do that than just going through the GUI, and that is editing the gitignore file directly. Now, by right-clicking something and hitting ignore, what Bitbucket did is it created this gitignore file. The .gitignore file specifies a bunch of patterns that we can use to ignore particular bits of information from getting committed into our repository. So if I go ahead and open this up, we'll see that Unity Client Editor and Unity Client Library and Unity Editor Library have both been ignored, which is what we did through the GUI. But let's go ahead and add some other stuff that we want to ignore. For example, let's go ahead and ignore a what do we want to ignore? We want to ignore some user-specific files like .sou. That's a Visual Studio user-specific file. .user and .sln, .doc states. We want to ignore debug and release folders, so uppercase D, lowercase d, bug, uppercase R, lowercase r, release. We want to ignore OBJ files. We want to ignore PCH files and PDB files. These are all build artifacts and debugging symbols we don't want. We'll also want to ignore a bunch of other stuff. I'm trying to forget what we want to ignore. We want to ignore resharper. So that's just going to be resharper star. And I think for now, no, we also want to ignore uppercase B, lowercase b in, and uppercase O, lowercase o, bj. I think for now, we'll also want to ignore our thumbs.db files and our desktop.ini files, which Windows Explorer likes to throw into our code. And I think that is about it for now. We might find some other stuff to ignore in the future, in which case we'll just edit the gitignore file. So I'm going to close out of the gitignore file and hit save and come back to SourceTree, and we should see a bunch of files disappear. If I hit F5, you'll notice a bunch of stuff disappeared, and we're left with our assets, our project settings, our CS projes, our CS files, our configs, our XAMLs, our resexes, our configs, our slins, and our packages that were downloaded via NuGet. And that's pretty much it. That's all the code that we really want to commit. Everything else is just temporary garbage or user-specific garbage that we do not want to commit to our repository because it might change on a developer-by-developer basis. So let's go ahead and stage all of these changes by hitting this convenient little stage button. So all of these are staged. Let's commit them all in a group, and I'm going to call this initial commit. And then I'm going to say, down here, I'm going to say push commits immediately to origin. So this way, when I hit commit, it'll not only commit, but it'll also push. So now I've effectively synchronized all of my data or structure of my project straight up into GitHub, and I can verify that by not GitHub, Bitbucket. How many times have I said GitHub instead of Bitbucket?
That was the only time I caught it, but you corrected yourself before I said anything. So.
Alrighty. So now we've committed that, and if I go into source, we now have all of our projects, all of our Unity projects, and our README and our gitignore. So as far as creating the skeleton of our project, getting it up on Bitbucket and allowing us to be able to modify that code with Bitbucket, I think that just about wraps up this video.
Awesome.
All right, we'll see you guys next video.
We're ready to go.
All right.